Russian President Vladimir Putin, his critics say, is waging two wars, one on Ukraine, the other a long-standing war to crush dissent inside Russia. Few Russian dissidents know that better than Vladimir Kara-Murza. He's a protege of the late Boris Nemtsov, a vocal Putin critic who was assassinated outside the Kremlin in 2015. 3 months after his assassination, Kara-Murza was poisoned, then again in 2017. He nearly died both times. Kara-Murza joined Power and Politics in 2017, just 4 months after surviving that second poisoning.
Both times I went into a coma with multiple organ failure. I was on life support. And both times doctors estimated my chance of survival. This is what they told my wife, at 5%. So I'm very fortunate and certainly very grateful to be sitting here with you today.
Kara-Murza was arrested in April of this year after opposing Putin's war on Ukraine. He's been in prison ever since. And 2 weeks ago, Russian authorities charged him with high treason. He's facing more than 20 years in prison. With me in studio this evening is Evgenia Kara-Murza, Vladimir's wife. She's also an advocacy coordinator at the Free Russia Foundation. Over in Toronto, Bill Browder is with us as well. He's the head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign and CEO of Hermitage Capital. Bill and Evgenia, great to meet you. Good to have you here. I did want to start with you, and I wanted to ask you first, and we have just explained the circumstances your husband faces. How are you doing?
I'm still standing. So that's, I have 3 kids at home, young kids, a husband in a Russian jail. I live on the plane. I can't really afford to fall apart, so I'm good.
You're also here advocating, and you're doing so by meeting with the top politicians in this country, including the Foreign Affairs Minister, the leader of the Conservative Party, the leader of the NDP. What is your central message to them in those meetings?
Well, I am not only campaigning for my husband. I am, of course. He's my best friend. He's the father of my children, and his safety, his life, are the utmost importance to me. But I'm also continuing his work on behalf of Russian civil society, his work on behalf of political prisoners in the Russian Federation. And my husband has recently become one of them, and he's now facing up to 24 years in a high security prison because of the new high treason charges against him. And he's one of 500 political prisoners in the Russian Federation, according to Memorial, Russia's most respected human rights NGO. That number is growing by the day. Vladimir Putin is leading 2 wars at the same time. His first war is against Ukraine, where he just tries to erase the country from the face of the earth. An absolutely horrendous result of over 2 decades of impunity that Vladimir Putin has enjoyed while committing all those crimes against his own people and our closest neighbors. And he's also leading this war against Russian civil society. He speaks of people like my husband and all other opponents of the regime as scum and insects that need to be spat out to cleanse Russian society of those elements.
I also want to drill down, Bill, though, into what motivates Putin in this crackdown, this sort of internal crackdown on dissidents. And you, of course, know better than most after what happened to your friend, Sergei Magnitsky, who died while he was in Russian custody. What is Putin's objective here?
Well, Putin is not a normal head of state like you would expect in other countries. He went into public service not to serve the public, but to serve his own personal financial interests, as everybody else in his government has done as well. And so over a 22-year period, Vladimir Putin and the 1,000 or so other people around him have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state, $1,000 billion. And that's money that should have been spent on healthcare, on education, on roads and schools and all sorts of other things. Instead, was spent on private jets and yachts and villas and so on. And that kind of thing you can get away with for 1 year or 3 years, maybe even 5 years. But after 22 years, Putin becomes very scared. He's very scared of his own people. And so what does he do to try to have his people not rise up against him? One is anybody who does try to say bad things about him, like Vladimir Kara-Murza, like Boris Nemtsov, like Alexei Navalny, end up either killed or in jail, or sometimes they try both. They tried to kill both Vladimir and Alexei and then failed and ended up putting them in prison. And then the other thing that Putin does is he tries to deflect the anger against a foreign enemy, which is what this war in Ukraine is all about. There's no genuine beef between the Russian and Ukrainian people. This is a manufactured war by Vladimir Putin to stay in power, to deflect anger that people would have against him towards a foreign enemy.
So, Evgenia, what does that necessitate then, specifically from politicians who tonight are probably watching you in the Canadian government and in opposition parties? What specific response would you like them to have to Putin's actions where any sort of internal dissidence is involved?
Well, I think the correct response would be enough is enough. And there are three factors that would bring closer the downfall of the regime. And that is the only condition for that region and for Europe to finally be at peace. You know, and so the first key factor, I would say, is Ukraine's victory in this war, of course, because a lot in Russia depends on whether Vladimir Putin can win or lose this war. And so Ukraine needs all the help that Ukraine has to get. Well, it's just weapons, humanitarian help, all that Ukraine needs to make sure that every single Russian soldier leaves the Ukrainian territory, including the illegally occupied zones. So that is the first factor. The second key factor, I think, is, sanctions. Both economic sanctions that make it costlier for the regime to carry on with warmonging, and targeted sanctions, because targeted sanctions are an incredibly powerful tool. They are designed to target specific individuals implicated in gross human rights violations. So they bring them to accountability. And I think that this is why this legislation, the Magnitsky legislation, is a revolutionary legislation. And the third factor, I think, is support and solidarity with that part of Russian civil society that continues protesting both inside and outside of the country. Despite propaganda, despite incredible draconian measures thrown at people, despite the widespread use of torture, humiliation, rape, use of punitive psychiatry against protesters, people still go out in the streets to protest. And there have been countless NGOs and human rights activists, journalists who have been forced to leave the country, and they're very willing and they're very well prepared to continue their work on behalf of Russian civil society. And I think the reason they need all the support and solidarity they can get from the Western democratic community is that these people are going to be the ones to rebuild the country after it all collapses. They're going to be the ones to make sure that Russia will never become something like it has been under Vladimir Putin, that they will be the ones to change it and to make sure that we don't go back.
Bill, I have just a few seconds left. We had the Ukraine, just jumping off the points that Evgenia was making, we had the Ukrainian foreign minister on last week who is advocating for the West to do more to isolate Russia in order to achieve some of the objectives that we just heard laid out. And in particular is asking Canada and other countries in the West to ban Russians from visiting here. Do you think that would be helpful?
I do. I think that we have to carve out the Russians who are like Vladimir Kara-Murza that are standing up to Putin, who we know are dissidents and opponents of the regime. Those people should be welcome. But all the other Russians who have been fleeing, a lot of these people have not said a word for a long time about what Vladimir Putin's up to, and particularly in the last year, they've supported the war. And all of a sudden, when it comes and affects their own personal interests, then they're running for the borders and asking for asylum. We have enough problems with the Ukrainian refugees, with the Afghan refugees, with real, genuine refugees. These people should all be back in Russia standing up to Putin instead of running and trying to clog up our asylum system when we have all these genuine refugees. They should be the ones who say no more to Vladimir Putin instead of running and leaving the country, continuing to fight a war.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I'm out of time, unfortunately. Thank you very much, both of you, for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.